August 24th, 1995. As of the publishing of this video, this particular product is going to turn 30 years old, and that goes to Microsoft's own Windows 95 operating system. Windows 95 was an overhaul to the previous Windows release version 3.1, not just in a technological way with its plug-and-play hardware support, long file names, and 32-bit program support with the brand new Win32 API, in addition to its backward compatibility with 16-bit programs and drivers for that matter. It also brought forth the Explorer user interface, and with it the Start button and taskbar that had become the defining feature for Windows into this modern day. Windows 95 was actually sort of a genuine effort to listen to customer feedback, and truly was a revolution for the PC industry when it was new, something that could finally give Apple's Macintosh System 7.5 a run for its money. The part that really makes Windows 95 that much more memorable, though, is its iconic startup sound. This was made by Brian Eno, and in fact it was actually created on a Macintosh of all things, which is kind of interesting to think about when you put it into perspective of being for Windows 95. Anyways, doesn't matter. Speaking of iconic sounds, the marketing for Windows 95 was just purely insane, with a $300 million budget to market the software, with many television advertisements playing the iconic 1981 Rolling Stones song Start Me Up, which directly called out the Start button, which really did make a heck of a lot of sense when you think about it for the new defining feature of the operating system. There's also a new tagline for Microsoft at the time of launch, which was, "Where do you want to go today?" which actually persisted in a stock caption for the scrolling marquee screensaver in Windows 95. How cute. So today, let's take a moment to kind of gloss and reflect on these two major operating systems, Windows 3.1 and Windows 95, and just have fun exploring and seeing what the differences are between the two major operating systems. So let's dive in. Now for the demonstrations today, I'm using 86 box and I'm using my M4 MacBook Air, so we're going to be using MacBox today to demonstrate these two operating systems, starting off with Windows 3.1. So as you can see, we're not immediately starting into Windows. As you can see there, it says starting MS-DOS, and here we are. Now, many OEMs actually set Windows 3.1 to start up when the computer started up by simply placing its executable name into autoexec.bat. But for those who are not familiar with that, don't worry, many people weren't either. In fact, MS-DOS was more so of a foreign concept to a lot of people that were new to computers in the early to mid-1990s, and I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them didn't know what the heck this whole command line interface even was. Most of the time, I'm sure they probably saw Windows and just stuck to that. But regardless, this is actually the operating system that Windows 3.1 runs atop of, and this is, of course, Microsoft's own MS-DOS, in this case, version 6.22. And this is more of a terse interface, if you will. Now, it's not to say that it isn't capable, but there was definitely a learning curve involved with this. For example, you'd obviously have to know to type the ver command to see the actual version of the operating system. Likewise, to clear the screen, you'd have to know that the command for that is CLS. And it goes beyond that in many different ways. Of course, this mouse cursor is not, in fact, part of DOS. This is just the macOS mouse cursor. So if I click into this, you can see it goes away. Sorry about that. I didn't want to make any confusion. So regardless, Windows 3.1, as you can see, we're not currently running it. And 3.1, if you will, was sort of like the last gasp of this so-called like operating environment. Dare say it is an operating system. And yes, I dare say it is an operating system because, well, it does require MS-DOS. And technically speaking, Windows 95 also runs on top of MS-DOS, but the way that Windows 95 does it is a little bit different, and we'll see that later in the video. So let's go ahead and jump into Windows 3.1. Now, with the documentation that you would receive with this operating system and or with your computer, if it isn't set to automatically start up into Windows when you booted up the machine, then you would need to type this command in manually to start the operating system, and that is win. And here you can see it starts up. Now, I am going to come clean. I am technically running Windows for Workgroups 3.11 today, but that's just because I happen to have that on hand. So some things might look slightly different in comparison to normal Windows 3.1, but we're not going to worry about that for at least the purposes of today. And here we are at Windows 3.1. I just went ahead and I adjusted the resolution of the system so that way it'd be a little bit more visible on the video. But regardless, this is going to be a similar experience at a higher resolution versus a lower resolution. So this is the experience that you'd see inside of Windows at this time. You'd see this window called the Program Manager. And the Program Manager is like your launcher. It is the ever-encompassing, above everything else kind of window in the system. And you can't get rid of it. It's always there, and this is where your programs live. And so, as you can see amongst this sea of, well, gray, there are some launching, well, there we call it groups. I think these were called groups. And inside of these groups would contain shortcuts, or in this case, launchers, to different programs on the system. So, for example, File Manager, you can find inside of the main group. And you'd also have to know that that's where it's located. It's kind of convoluted in a sense. Like, it's kind of just everywhere, but also it's not really well shown or well demonstrated, if you know what I mean. But we'll kind of figure that stuff out as we go along. Anyway, so File Manager, as you can see, it is a file manager, and that's where you browse your files. I mean, whoop-de-doo, right? Yeah, it's a kind of primitive way to do it. I mean, yes, there's a window within a window and so on and so forth, and it's just, it works. It definitely does get the job done, don't get me wrong. Like, you know, you can jump between drives, and you can then browse your files in the system. You can launch applications from here, and so on and so forth as you need to. But here's a concept that is definitely confusing. This menu at the top left has all these options in it, and there is an option to close the program, don't get me wrong, but you have to know that that's what it does. There's no real major indication of what does what. So you have these arrows, and you might think, well, this one kind of makes sense, like this up arrow. I mean, you click it, and it makes the window full screen. Here you go. But what does this mean, you know? And what does this do? Oh, now it's just gone behind the Program Manager. Okay, so that's how that does. Well, technically, but also not technically, this is the desktop of Windows 3.1. As you can see, you have the programs that I just minimized here, but that's it. There's no other icons, there's no bar, there's no real anything, and you can't right-click on this desktop background to change it or to interact with it in any way. There's just no options for that. Now, clicking on these icons does give you the same context menu that you saw before, but again, yeah, it's just not the most user intuitive, if you will. Of course, Switch 2 doesn't do what you want it to do. It actually opens up this task list. Dare say it's a task manager, which would be called in later releases of Windows, most notably the NT versions. But in order to bring one of these programs back up, you'd have to know to either click Restore or to double click on the actual icon to restore the window to the forefront. And we'll do the same thing here with File Manager. And one thing you can also do is that menu icon up here, you can also double click on that to close a program. That is in fact the default action. Kind of interesting that that's how they set it up, but this was 1992. The concept of a graphical user interface, aside from the Macintosh, was still quite a new thing for many computer users, and a lot of them that were still using DOS primarily up to this point. So yeah, quite the learning curve indeed, if you will. I mean, I don't know, maybe that's just my observation of it. Now, of course, that's not all the software on the system. There are other groups that we can browse. So while File Manager is under here, there is a control panel. And inside of this control panel, which I'll bring back up to the forefront here, you can see it does contain some system settings. And, well, it's just kind of a bit, well, okay, it's functional, don't get me wrong, but they're not really organized in a logical way. Like, they're not alphabetically sorted. And what the heck is this enhanced thing, like this 386 enhanced thing? And I can see some people that are not aware of what this is supposed to do. But of course, Windows 3.1, at least originally, was a 16-bit operating environment that ran on top of DOS. And this enhanced thing is designed to give some 32-bit extensions to the operating system to take advantage of Intel's 386 processor architecture and newer, to give things like virtual memory, scheduling, and so on and so forth. Those are some of the features of the 386 CPU, specifically the 386DX and 486DX by this point. So as you can see, this is where you can set up a virtual memory file on the drive. And say if you're running low on physical memory, then the system could do what's called a swap over to this virtual memory, therefore kind of, sort of, but not really giving you more physical RAM, but that's not really the case. It helps with the system performance. That's basically all you really need to know about that. Likewise, obviously you don't see that in Windows 95, but one thing that was seen here and will be improved upon with Windows 95 is this drivers panel. As you can see, this is what it looks like. It just shows a list of what devices are currently installed, what other drivers, and you can add or remove them, and if you're lucky, you might have a setup option if you pick, let's just say, the Sound Blaster, and you can come in here and you can change any relevant settings. But suffice it to say, it's very basic, it's very primitive, and so that would be greatly expanded upon with the introduction of the plug-and-play backend in Windows 95. Likewise, the personalization of Windows got much improved with Windows 95. So this is where you would change, in at least 3.1 and some prior versions, your desktop wallpaper, screensaver, and so on and so forth. And it's not very clear as to what one did which. There's no previews, and there's no stretching of the wallpaper to fill the screen, and so on and so forth. So it's a very basic way of doing things. Now, it is functional in nature. Say you want to go and play the Starfield simulation thing, well, you can click test, and there you go. Or say you want to have fun and use the Flying Windows screensaver, which is kind of a classic for Windows users, well, there you go. And this one did have a little bit more computational requirements behind it, but there you go, you have Flying Windows, which also funnily kind of messes with the screen in the case of 86 box. This display adapter emulation is not perfect, but it gets the job done for the video today, so bear with me on this. It's just going to leave some fringing on the screen until I draw over it again. Yeah, it's functional, but it's very much like basic. Like it's kind of like it's tossed together and it's like, well, that's it. That's all we need to do. That sort of thing. I don't know. I'm not crazy for it, but I mean, given what the end user experience was like back then, there really wasn't much of a definition of how things were supposed to be done. It was like Microsoft was trying to basically write their own rule book here, if you will. Likewise, you got printers, and color is for theming the system. So, you could go in and you could pick different color schemes. And if your display adapter actually had more color support, you could actually see a lot of these in more colors. But obviously for people who only had the basic VGA, you'd only have access to the real basic VGA palette, which wasn't very much. But, you could change your color scheme pretty much like that, and you were off to the races. So it's a very much functional but kind of a crude environment. Like, there are applications built into Windows like Paintbrush, which, that's pretty nice. So you can create bitmaps in here. Windows Write later became WordPad, and it also gained quite a significant visual overhaul, but inside of here you can see it's just a text editor, and it would actually save files in what was known as the .wri extension. And pretty much later versions of Windows don't like that format. Most of the time they just save it in .rtf or rich text format, but I don't think that came until Windows 95 anyway. So it did have backward compatibility for a little while with .wri files if you had it and upgraded to Windows 95, but yeah, it was quite the... Well, it wasn't limited. It definitely had more features than, say, Notepad does, which is just the classic Notepad before they updated it in Windows 11. And so, there's that. But anyway, Recorder is actually a unique program where it logs your steps to create a macro, if you will, in case you wanted to use that for any purpose where you would need to do that sort of function. Windows 3.1 was also one of the last versions of Windows to include this clock application. Since obviously Windows didn't have a taskbar, this is how you would check the time without having to go out to DOS or to have a physical clock somewhere on your person or in the room you were in. Optionally, there'd be some other things that you could have, like the character map, and there would be, for people who had sound cards, a media player and a sound recorder, which was quite nice. And these are just specific to Windows for Workgroups, not this one in particular, this TCP over IP folder, but the network folder. That one is specifically added with Windows for Workgroups 3.11. You do have access to games. Now, Windows for Workgroups does include Hearts, but Windows 3.1 included Solitaire and Minesweeper games built into the system when you actually had it installed. And they were quite nice. Like, you could play a game of Solitaire on your computer. Now, I'm not going to play through an entire game of Solitaire here today. As much as I think it would probably entertain some people in the viewing audience, I don't personally want to waste your time. So we're going to move on. And so you kind of get the idea of what Program Manager is doing here. And unfortunately, you can't actually close out of this, much to your chagrin, because then you're going to get this box that comes up saying this will end your Windows session. So, as mentioned before, this is over everything else as far as launching into your software, and any software that you install that was meant for running on Windows would create its own group and would make its own icon here, else you'd have to make your own group, technically speaking. These menu options also, they don't highlight when you hover your mouse over them. Additionally, they don't move without you having to click on each menu option. You have to click on them each one by one. So that's how that sort of thing would work. So suffice it to say, this is the Windows experience before 95. It was functional, but you probably needed a book to read to train yourself on how this operating system worked. So there was a little bit of a learning curve, and I think some people were willing to put up with it. Not everybody was, and for that matter, this would all, for the most part, change with Windows 95, at least visually. So let's go ahead and exit out of 3.1, and let's jump into the world that was Windows 95. Now, as mentioned before, Windows 3.1 wasn't really much of an operating system in the technical term. While, yes, it is an OS that's kind of retroactively defined these days, I consider it somewhat to be more of an operating environment because it runs on top of MS-DOS. Now, while Windows 95 also runs on top of MS-DOS, it more or less actually makes itself into more of a standalone environment, where once you're in Windows 95, you're not required to go into DOS in the conventional way. So you'll see that as I start this operating system up on this other virtual machine. As you can see, it doesn't say starting MS-DOS, it in fact shows Windows 95 splash screen. And that Microsoft Plus text you see there, we'll talk about momentarily. So here we are in Windows 95, and this one I actually really haven't done a whole heck of a lot besides obviously installing Microsoft Plus, which I'll talk about what that does here in just a little bit. But the most obvious difference is not just the wallpaper, although you could technically set the same one as before. The major differences were the user interface. As you can see, there's a lot going on now in comparison to Windows 3.1. And you might be asking, well, where's the Program Manager? Well, there is no Program Manager, at least not by default. But for the purposes of this video, we're just going to assume it doesn't exist anymore. And this is what you would see when first booting up Windows 95. Or if you had an in-place upgrade, you'd probably see a little bit more going on. But suffice it to say, this is pretty much what you would see when starting up Windows 95 for the first time. Now, I used the CD edition to install Windows 95 RTM, or Release to Manufacturing, so I do have more icons on my desktop than would be on the floppy disk version. Now, Windows 95 was originally sold with two different editions, which was a CD-ROM version, like I've installed here, and there's also a 3.5-inch floppy diskette version. There is also a very excruciatingly rare edition of Windows 95 that was shipped on 5.25-inch floppy disks. Now, once that materializes, that'll be a very fascinating installation because I'm sure that was not very common, but that would probably have been used on some systems running 386 or 486 CPUs, and didn't have access to a CD-ROM drive, or for that matter, they didn't have or weren't willing to use the 3.5-inch floppy diskette version. It was a mail order only option, and again, excruciatingly rare. Who knows if it actually did come to fruition, or if Microsoft were just hoping that no one would actually put them up for it. So who knows? Now, some of the pioneering aspects of the Explorer user interface are immediately present. As you can see, the Start button is down here at the bottom left. It's ready to allow you to do whatever with your computer, as it says click here to begin. Once we click on that menu, you can see we're greeted with these menus. And these menus are logical in nature. Programs are for your software, Documents is for your data, Settings is the settings for the computer or other devices, Find is search, Help is, self-explanatory, and Run is also self-explanatory, as is shutting down the computer with that really creative icon there. Now, these icons are courtesy of the Plus Pack, which was sold alongside Windows 95 shortly after its launch, which gave you some unique add-ons and some system improvements that was probably worth purchasing back in 1995 or later, depending on when you purchased a computer running Windows 95 or your own license to use Windows 95 standalone. This menu alone, from an ease of use standpoint, was so groundbreaking once you figured out how it worked. It took less mouse clicks to launch software, and for that matter, it was more intuitively categorized, and programs were not stored in these weird groups that you'd have to double click and open unless you really wanted to, and they were more or less sensibly categorized. Like accessories actually contained all of the other functions of the system accessories instead of being spread out into like 2 or 3 different folders. There they were inside of this single folder on the system. And the other applications for third-party software would show up in this menu alongside the system ones. And Windows Explorer just so happens to be the main event that makes, again, Windows 95 very special. If we open it, you can see it takes us directly into our hard disk, which is drive letter C here. And we get to look at what is on the root of this drive. And if we want to continue farther on, we can double click and drill into a folder like the Windows folder here. And if we want to go even farther than that, we can double click and go into the media folder. And it just goes on from there. Now, a lot of the options from the file manager, which got replaced by Explorer here, are not immediately present, but they are either combined into doing things like right-click context menus. This was a brand new feature in Windows 95, where a lot of these cut, copy, delete, rename, properties, that sort of stuff was hidden away inside of this contextual menu. And on your mouse, that's where you'd use the right mouse button. Or if you were using the accessibility features built into Windows 95, you could also set the mouse to work with your left hand if you were a lefty, and use the opposite side of the mouse as your right mouse button. And so you have options based on what file you have brought the contextual menu to. So for example, here we have a WAV file, and so we could simply press play, and as you can see, it plays the file inside of a program. And that's pretty self-explanatory. But if you have, say, a program like the recycle bin, for example, you can see the options completely change. And we have an option to empty the recycle bin. Now, the recycle bin was sort of like a new concept at this time. It was like a place where you could store files that you didn't want, and then when you were done with them and you were for sure ready to part ways with them, you could then delete them. This is more of a two-step safety barrier as compared to before in Windows 3.1, where as soon as you deleted a file, it was gone. It was in the ether, and you could not get that sucker back without restoring from a backup if you were actually doing backups. So this was more or less a resting place for data that is not wanted, and when you were truly done with it, you could then empty the recycle bin, and it would then remove itself from your hard drive. So that was a nice peace of mind feature, even if you had to know that's where your data was going when you told it to delete. Likewise, these new menu options contain some of the stuff from before, and, well, it's just generally simplified. One thing that's also immediately apparent is the design of the window title bar. No longer do you have this like weird menu thing that's up here at the top left like it did before in Windows 3.1, but you also have an icon showing what program is open, and all of the main window controls are up here in the top right. So your close is now an X button, which is all it does. You have your maximize and restore and minimize buttons, which are differently iconed, so you actually know what to do when you click on them, sort of, in that sense. And this is another thing that was new with the Explorer user interface. You can see when I minimize the window, instead of making an icon on the desktop, you can see it minimizes into the bar at the bottom, that's being, the taskbar. And you could then restore it from clicking on it, and likewise you could actually click on this window too in certain instances. I think in later versions of Windows you could actually click on this to minimize it. All this does, clicking on it now, is just to restore the window to the forefront if it was already minimized. And you can see the stylization of the button indicates whether it is closed or minimized, or if it's indented like that, it is open and the active window on your screen, hence the color of the title bar being made active. And another distinction is if you had an inactive window, then the title bar would then go gray. Of course, you could configure these colors in the operating system to be whatever you wanted, including bright shades of hot pink if you so desired, and Windows would just simply let you do that. So, all in all, the Explorer interface, and this is just skin deep, there was plenty more that went into the Explorer user interface, including the system tray. The system tray is where useful applets, or little icons that display program or driver information, and they would show up here at the bottom right, and they'd be categorized by the clock. The clock basically got replaced by this taskbar entry, and you can hover your mouse over it to get your current date and the day of the week, in addition to the clock that is always present. Now, it doesn't have to be present, but it is by default present. You can turn that off. That is another thing that you can do, is you can customize this to show the clock or to auto hide this taskbar, and so on and so forth. You can also have small icons if you choose to do so. And you can also customize the start menu by adding or removing items from it as it shows there, and you can clear the history of the Documents menu if you so desire. The Documents menu does show a list of all the files that have been played on the system at any given time. Likewise, you can click on these icons down below at the bottom right, like for example the volume control, and you get access to, as it shows, changing your system volume, and you can click away from it and you're done. So that's pretty nice. But let's say you want more. Well, you can double click this and get access to a whole mixer, which gives you access to all the volume control sliders, including your line in and MIDI volume controls, as well as the master, that you can modify to your heart's content at any time. So again, pretty powerful user interface from 1995. This was really a far away step above compared to Windows 3.1 in terms of not just its ease of use in many ways, but also for the customization and the extra stuff that it gives you. But it's not just extra stuff for giving you extra stuff. It's actually extra stuff that not only you can use, but you can configure however you want. It's pretty slick. Now, these icons here are on the desktop because I think Microsoft's philosophy was that this is a resting place for shortcuts, files, and other things that you want to do with your computer. This is its own space, and you could put whatever you wanted here, and you could manage it however you wanted. And, of course, I did show that there were documents. Now, there was no, at least at this time, there was no concept of a documents folder. That just didn't exist. So, like Windows 3.1, you'd manage your files the barbarian way, which was putting them in folders on your hard drive wherever you had access to them. And yes, in many ways, it was probably also tossed into the Windows folder by accident, whatever. But as you can see, there are some things in here that we can take a look at, including a group converter for Windows 3.1 groups. Run DLL 32 is actually how you get certain programs to run from DLL files as a program. So one example of this was the way you personalized your computer. On the desktop, you can now right-click, and in addition to having options for arranging your desktop icons and lining them up, you can also make new files And depending on the programs that you had installed, you could actually probably see more options in this list. But of course, third-party programs had to add support for that in the Win32 API. That's what allows a lot of this functionality. But you can also click on Properties, and Properties would take you into here. This is a Run DLL32 program built with the Win32 API, sorry. And this allows for the pattern and wallpaper changes like you could do in Windows 3.1, only now you have access to see what the pattern or the wallpaper looks like before you apply it, with the Apply button, of course. And likewise, you could go in and you can change what the actual wallpaper was, and say you just want to have the clouds, for example, but you want to have the buttons pattern. Well, I mean, it seems kind of silly, but you could totally do that. Likewise, you can also change your screensaver in here, and you can pick whichever one you want. I have more options than what come with Windows 95 by default since I have the Plus pack installed, but we can take a look at the scrolling marquee screensaver, and you can see the first thing it shows is where do you want to go today, that Microsoft slogan that they introduced with Windows 95 and used for quite a number of years after its introduction into the market. So honestly, not surprised in the slightest that they would want to demonstrate that. Additionally, you can see there's some things for Energy Star, for power saving, if your hardware supported that. Additionally, another thing that Windows 95 had brought forth, which I didn't really mention because it was hardware dependent, was ACPI, or I think it was the Advanced Computer Power Interface, or something like that. There's like an acronym for ACPI. I'm pretty sure I'm correcting myself on the screen right now as I'm talking about this, but basically it would give you the option for soft power, if you will. So you don't have to, on your computer, when you tell it to shut down, you don't always necessarily have to flick off the switch. Although if you had a computer built on the AT standard, you would still have to do that. You'd still have to physically switch off the computer. But if you had a more modern computer, especially in the later versions of Windows, this would be where your system would allow you to turn it off when you tell it to shut down. It would automatically power itself off. This was very useful for laptops when you're done using them. Likewise, this would be your colors control panel in Windows 3.1, and right here, this is where you could go and you could create new schemes just like before, pick from a color palette, and vice versa. You could see the changes apply here on the screen in real time. Plus is its own tab, and of course this would be the last tab that you'd conventionally see in Windows 95, which has your color palette and desktop area as it's called, but more or less that'd just be your desktop resolution. Now, since I don't have the full driver installed, I can't change the resolution, but I can change the color depth, but whatever. Some other things that Windows 95 actually got right was inside of its control panel. Now, as I mentioned before, there was this thing for plug-and-play hardware support, and that was a big deal for Windows 95, which its goal was to make hardware easier to install and easier to get running. Back before Windows 95, things like sound cards and other peripheral devices that you installed into your computer's expansion slots, whether it be via internal PCI slots or ISA slots, or VISA local bus slots in the case of some computers, or EISA if you really had a high-end workstation, or PCM-CIA if you had a laptop computer. All of those things actually apply technically under this umbrella of plug-and-play hardware support. What Windows would do is try to automatically determine the best settings and drivers to use for new hardware, and that way it could automate the installation of them so it took less time to perform, and you could get to using your hardware right away. So this wizard here, the Add New Hardware wizard, would help assist with that, especially if you had hardware that was not yet plug-and-play compliant or compatible. This is where you could install it, configure your driver, and configure the settings, and you'd be off to the races. This whole wizard thing was a new concept as well in Windows 95, where these wizards they basically took input from you, any kind of text, settings, and the like, and they would then go off and do their thing and configure the system accordingly, and they'd be a little bit more automated and a little bit faster than traditional installations. Now, these aren't a new concept. Anything that was basically installed in Windows 3.1 or well, a lot of, actually, I shouldn't say like most or all of them were, they had these installation wizards too. And this sort of concept was also brought forth to Windows 3.1. So this isn't anything unique or special or anything like that. It's just this happened to be built into the system. So it's pretty nice. Likewise, there's other things too for managing multimedia. Windows 95 had expanded multimedia support, including CD-ROM support, and later it would have support for what was known as the DirectX API. And the DirectX API was useful for 3D graphics and hardware accelerated visuals inside of video games. And what it also brought forth was better hardware accelerated sound support. So if you had a sound card that had improved MIDI or was surround sound capable in later years, then that's what the DirectX API would be more compliant with, and you get more features or better performance by taking advantage of those in their appropriate ways. And another thing that Windows 95 certainly got right was built-in networking. So it's not configured right now, but if you had a workgroup and you had the workgroup edition of Windows 3.1, then this was all now built in to Windows 95, and you didn't need to buy the specific workgroup edition to take advantage of being inside of a workgroup on a network, whether it be a dial-up network or a T1 network or token ring or Ethernet at the time. And so, yeah, it was pretty nice to have that built in. You didn't need to buy the specific SKU of Windows to take advantage of that. Likewise, other aspects of your computer's hardware were easily manageable in here, such as your modems. So you could go in and you can manage your modem through here. Likewise, printers had its own section, and it goes on from there. And you can also take a look at your system properties from here if you so desired to do so. And you can see now your drivers are inside of what's called the device manager. And the device manager shows all the hardware in the system, what hardware doesn't have a driver, and makes it easy to remove drivers or update drivers from this screen. And as you can see right now, I don't have any missing drivers, but they would show up here if you did. Likewise, there are some other things for docking station setups for laptops, so that's where this would come in. And also, if you wanted to see the performance status of the system, you could do so under here as well. And the nice thing about Windows 95 was because of its backward compatibility with DOS and 16-bit applications and drivers, you can run 16-bit drivers inside of Windows 95, and theoretically they would work. It would just also tell you here that that's, some of the stuff that you'd be putting up with. Likewise, there's some other settings under here for the system. I'm not going to go too crazy into it, but suffice it to say, you can manage your virtual memory settings in here because Windows 95 was completely a 32-bit operating system to boot, so you couldn't start up the operating system on a 286. So things like virtual memory basically just got baked into the system properties, if you will. But it went even farther than that. There are things that you could customize now that you couldn't before, like your mouse cursor, which is built into the system. You didn't need a third-party application to do that for you now. Likewise, desktop themes, that came as part of the Plus add-on. And the Plus add-on was sold alongside Windows 95. And it gave you some, but not all of the following, depending on how you configured it, of course. But you got access to things like desktop themes, a system task scheduler. It also gave you access to a video game built into the pack, which was called 3D Pinball Space Cadet, which ought to sound very familiar to you if you've played the game on Windows XP in modern times, or at least have heard about it. And there is so much more to it than that, including the ability to compress your disk to save space. That was a common thing for hard drives back in the 1990s. You'd have to compress them to save disk space because that disk space was very precious back then, and hard drives were still very expensive for higher capacities. Of course, as time went on, that fluctuated around a bit, but suffice it to say, you would rely on disk compression, and therefore you actually couldn't even upgrade your operating system or do certain tasks on the system because of the disk compression. So it was definitely a method of buying you some time before you could actually get yourself a larger hard drive or a different computer or whatever you needed to do. And so yeah, Windows 95, just from a usability and a technological standpoint, was massive. And yes, it wasn't perfect. I mean, obviously, browsing around the system, you got Windows spammed out the wazoo. And so, launching into software and doing some navigation on the system, yeah, it was definitely quite a mess. And so, it wasn't that amazing as far as like a modern day retrospective on it, but back in the day, this was still quite the improvement in comparison to Windows 3.1. Things were more colorful, things had clearer labeling, and there's just so much more capability in the system compared to 3.1 that it just overhauled what you could feasibly do with a computer. And the programs that came out for Windows 95, both good and bad, helped to reinvigorate and just lay down Windows as the operating system to have on your computer. And so it even holds true today for many retro computer users who actually put Windows 95 on some of their hardware instead of doing other operating systems. So for retro gaming purposes, primarily that's what it was for. But I mean, obviously there's other needs for Windows 95. So I think we've pretty much explored and discussed a lot of the highlights of Windows 95. I think for wrapping up this video, let's take a look at the Easter eggs on the system, and we'll then bring this video to a close. So there are 2 known Easter eggs for Windows 95, and they each have their own interesting output. So let's take a look at the first one, and that is the product team credits. To do this, you'll go and right-click on the desktop and create a folder. Inside this folder, you're going to give it the following name. And you do have to type it exactly as it's shown on the screen, because the case and the symbols and everything for that matter does matter when triggering these Easter eggs. So go ahead and press enter on that once you've got that set. Right click on it and then click rename. And then you will type the following to replace this file name. And then one more time, you'll want to rename that file. And for this last one, you do want to type this one, again, exactly as shown. And that does include the exclamation mark at the end. Assuming you've done everything correctly, when you double-click to open this folder, you will then be greeted with the following. There would normally be a MIDI file playing here, so let me see if I can actually get that to show up for you. Oh. Oh no. Help. Okay. That's, handy. Great. What did I do? So why is the sound driver causing Windows not to boot anymore? And as you can hear, the MIDI file will just loop around and it will just continue playing on a loop until you manually close out of here. So that's pretty much all there is for that particular Easter egg. It totally didn't just have to reinstall Windows 95 just now because of some weird bug, but let's move on. So let's go ahead and delete that, and I'll show you the next Easter egg, which is inside of the help system. So let's open up help. If you have a wizard that pops up, you're going to just go through the setup wizard and click finish, and you'll then be brought to this help topics Windows help thing. We're going to go ahead and click on find, and we're going to then do the following. Go to the options menu, and then what you need to do is use these search options called all the words you typed in any order for search for topics containing. Under show words that, you're going to use the option begin with the characters you type, and you're going to have the following be immediately after each keystroke, wait for a pause before searching. Once we do that, we'll then be brought to here. Now what we need to do is type in the following words: who knows who built this tool ? Now on your keyboard, hold down the left control and left shift keys and click on the clear button while holding those keys down on the keyboard. Now go into options. We're going to change the menu options, as you probably saw, to this one down here. At least one of the words you typed, and then where show words that is, you want to select contain the characters you type, and immediately after each keystroke, wait for a pause before searching will be enabled. Now, go back up to the search box, type in the shadow knows, exactly like that, with the capital S in there. Now, once again, hold down left control and left shift and click on the clear button while holding those keys down on the keyboard. And now, you will see this Easter egg pop up on your screen, which will of course contain development team credits, just in a less flashy form with no MIDI file as compared to the other Easter egg that we just taken a look at. And this, so we could just let this play if we wanted to, but for the sake of time, we're not going to. Additionally, inside of the C Windows Media folder, if we drill into there, you can see that there is a file that normally is not seen inside of Windows called clouds.midi. And that is the MIDI file from the Easter egg. And so you can actually listen to it in here if you so desire to. So that's pretty cool. And so with that, I think we've pretty much taken a look at what Windows 95 has on tap. There is so much more that I could actually talk about with this operating system, but I don't think my video today is going to do it justice. And for that matter, I feel like Windows 95, it needs to be experienced to be believed as to where we have come in computer history as far as advancements in ease of use and the power that has become our computers today. And it wouldn't have come if it wasn't for the Macintosh especially, but more importantly Windows 95, as Windows 95 brought forth so much to the table in terms of what a computer could do compared to before, that it totally just changed everything in terms of how we look at a PC today. It's amazing what they were able to come up with back in the 1990s. And really, we can only just thank Windows 95 for its service and what it has done for, pushing the needle as far as computers and what they can do for us. So I hope you liked this video today. If you liked it, the like button is down below and you can click it if you so desire. If you'd like to see more content that might interest you, the subscribe button is also down below. And you can click the bell if you also desire, as I do upload rather infrequently. And I think with that being said, let's go ahead and power off Windows 95 for this video. Happy birthday to Windows 95. It now is truly safe to turn off your computer. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.